Jump now. Jump in front of the car. Go on. Do it. No, don't. Don't cross the road. You can't.
So! その4人へボールのそうアビソそうじゃそうじゃThat's absolutely Adrianne
Coffee future, professional design, future concept, professional living and function, ready to be independent and wealth generation for entertainment. I have function for communication investment, coffee futures at 23% investment. I have to have shipper effect style, corporate coffee futures, professional design, future concept to have professional living and function, ready to be independent and wealth generation for entertainment. I have function for communication investment, coffee futures at 23% investment. I have to have effect style, corporate coffee
आप बोल क्यों
futures,
नहीं रहे हैं कुछ
professional design, future
जनाब
concept to have professional
कुछ तो बोलिए
money to be independent and wealth generation for entertainment. I have no function for communication and investment. Coffee futures at 20% investment.
भाग
Floating shipper.
वो तुझे पकड़ने आ रहे भाग
Coffee futures and professional design.
अबे उठ जा यार उठ और भाग नहीं तो वो तुझे पकड़ लेंगे भाग
You can do it. I believe in you. Just go for it. You can do it.
Yes.
At that point in my life, I decided to start recreationally smoking marijuana. And I did this without much thought to the consequences of what would happen by doing so. It didn't take long until after I started hearing voices calling out to me. I was shocked, but I wasn't overwhelmed. I thought it was a divine experience, and I was chosen because I was special. I was hearing up to 30 to 40 voices at once. Some sounded like family members, others sounded like friends, and there was a lot of celebrity voices as well. People like Will Ferrell, Emma Thompson, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and even our past Prime Minister, Stephen Harper. It was funny, when I was talking to him, he was busy telling me I was a brat, because all I would do was bug him, saying, like, how are you doing today? And he's like, I'm busy. He'd always say that to me. But if that was real, right? Things became rocky after a little bit. The voices at first had been kind. They started to become menacing. I remember one moment I was sleeping on a couch at my family's place, and the voices kept mocking me and jeering at me and telling me I should die and things like that. So I said, please, voices, just go away. And they said, okay, we'll go away if you go outside. So I said, oh, okay, I'll go outside. And so I went outside, and the voices disappeared, and I was so relieved. But then I went back inside, and all of a sudden they're like, "Ha, gotcha." And I was extremely distressed. I didn't know what to do at that point, but I was still smoking marijuana because it made me feel calm, and my anxiety would just dissipate. One day, I don't know how I did this, I decided to eat 2 grams of weed. After that, I psychosed, and I went spiraling on this journey with the voices in my head. They told me to take this walk, and they led me to my friend's house. There at my friend's house, they told me to grab a shovel, so I did, and then the voices said, "Now smash that window." So I did it, and then the voices say, "Well, get inside the room now." But then my friends caught me, and I tried to run away from them, and eventually they caught up to me, and they took me to the hospital.
When I was about 12, I was introduced to a group of people who were enthralling and delightful. They were entertaining and amusing, and I was captivated by their engaging conversations and their fascinating ideas. But just as easily, unfortunately, they'd turn on me, and their words would become brutal, humiliating, and very critical. They crushed my spirit with their savagery. Fortunately, or unfortunately, they said they would stick by me. They said they would never desert me. And they began to protect and guide me, but also punish me if I didn't do what they thought I should be doing. We would spend hours in deep conversation where I learnt the world's a dangerous place. They told me I was hated, that people were out there that wanted to get rid of me. They told me I was useless, that I was hopeless, that I was fat, that I was ugly, and I was stupid. Things I had tried so desperately to hide from myself and from others. But they had uncovered the truth. I became terrified of going out and suspicious of everyone. They told me I was a messenger from God, and they promised me redemption if I proved myself worthy. They led me down some very dark paths with promises of enlightenment, but all I ever experienced was bitter disappointment. I became dependent on them. My companions were authoritative, but they were vibrant, vital, and impossible to ignore. They knew so much about everything, and I was totally absorbed by them. Over time, it became hopeless to release myself from their clutches, and I excluded everyone from my life, including those people who were the most important, and those people who had dared to love me. I was now in a slave-master relationship. It's impossible to flourish in life when you are hidden from light. I constantly endeavoured to gain their approval, their praise, and an invitation into their inner sanctum, but that door remained closed to me. All of this disappointment just reinforced my internal self-loathing, which dominated my every thought, and I became marooned from all that's wondrous in this world. Yet without them, I felt so desolate, so alone, because they filled a huge void in my life. You see, I hear voices. I hear a variety of different voices, male, female, young, old. Some of them even have these crazy accents, and they are completely obsessed with me. They observe and remark on my every action, my every thought. There's no privacy. There's no place of sanctity. They can access my thinking at will. And I am never free of their ceaseless commentary and criticism. This collection of internal narrators meddles in every aspect of my life. There's little question that the primary objective of voices is to isolate, creating the ideal environment for them to have exclusive access to you. It deprives you of any alternative view, and you are completely dictated by their views. Trying to maintain the facade of being calm and in control when you're internally freaking out requires huge amounts of energy. When my internal and external world collide so dramatically, that is when you are likely to see me openly talking to my voices. And when our calls for help and acceptance are rejected, that makes that task so much more difficult. It's not a crazy person you see, but rather a person dealing with intolerable psychological and emotional pain. When you are overwhelmed, overcome by fear, and desperate, it's perfectly reasonable to hide yourself away and lick your wounds, to stay hidden. It's a very typical human response. It's not madness you're observing, it's a person trying to survive. You may be surprised to hear that 1 in 25 people report hearing voices. History, our history, is littered with voice hearers. There's Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, Joan of Arc, Winston Churchill. Their memories are not marred by being identified as a voice hearer. Rather, they are seen as heroic, great orators, great thinkers. Yet every one of them would be considered mentally ill by today's standards. As for me, I'm only mad because somebody else says I am. If I say, the neighbour told me, don't drink from the tap, it's contaminated, I'm socially connected and I can sustain relationships. Okay. If I say, a voice told me not to drink from the tap because it's contaminated, then clearly I'm crazy. And if I say, I hear the voices of dead people, I would probably get my own TV show.
Conversations for me are not the same as conversations for other people. So while you're asking me questions and while I'm answering them, I'm also hearing voices telling me that I suck, that my answers are awful.
Are any of the voices saying anything about us?
A few minutes ago, started hearing your voice, like from the inside. That voice is telling me, we want to leave, you're taking up our time.
You're hearing my voice right now telling you in your head that your answers are bad and that you suck. Yeah. How are you able to distinguish between the voice that sounds like me that's in your head and the voice that is me that's asking you a question?
I'm using a strategy. I'm looking at your mouth and I'm watching and making sure that you're not moving your lips. That way I'm able to kind of take that information and go back and realize that I'm hearing your voice, but other people around me are not hearing your voice. So I hear voices that other people around me aren't hearing. Sometimes they come from inside my head, sometimes they come from outside my head, sometimes they ping off the walls, sometimes I hear them from my organs. My name is Jeannie Bass. I'm a voice hearer. I'm also a mother. I work full-time as a certified peer specialist at a psych hospital.
Jeannie Bass is a leader in the Hearing Voices movement. It's a small global community for individuals who hear voices or have other extreme mental experiences, the kind of experiences that society labels crazy. But the movement believes that hearing voices isn't necessarily a sign of a mental illness, like schizophrenia. This conflicts with the traditional medical position that these voices are auditory hallucinations and are caused by the brain not working properly.
One of the problems with understanding your experiences under the umbrella of terms like schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder, which is what I was most commonly called, is that your life is limited by the diagnosis.
Jeannie takes medication, but believes her progress came from meeting other people like her and developing strategies to cope with their shared experiences. The movement is very new to the United States, and its organizing body, the Hearing Voices Network, sponsors over 100 support groups in 25 states.
We see these experiences as unique but common human experiences and something that's normal. You know, hearing voices is it's an audible experience for me, you know, I can hear it, and it's sometimes hard to realize that other people aren't hearing it as well. The thing with voices and people is that you can deal with them in the same way. Like when I take a shower, my voices will tell me to shave my head. I will feel a physical urge to reach for the razor, pick it up, and start shaving my hair off. You know, it's usually one particular voice that really pushes. So I will negotiate with the voice that, you know, if it stops making me feel the physical urge to reach for the razor and shave my precious hair off, instead of listening to music on the way to work, I will spend time talking to it and giving it attention. Same way you would negotiate with a child if they wanted something.
So hearing voices, for example, there's some estimates that up to 10% of the population hear voices. People that actually seek treatment or require treatment, this is probably about 2%, 3% at most. Part of it is trying to help people have a more reality-based view of their experiences. Some people do it kind of on their own. They sort of have an understanding that the voices that they hear, it's a product of their mind. While this experience may be disturbing or annoying, they generally function fairly well. They have jobs, they have families, they have kids.
Antipsychotic medication is the most common treatment for schizophrenia-related symptoms. Very few patients have access to therapy. Medication helps some patients, but not all, and it can cause serious side effects, like weight gain, low blood pressure, body tremors, and seizures. There are some in the Hearing Voices movement who reject psychiatry and the medical paradigm altogether.
Most people assume that people that hear voices don't want to hear them and want them to go away, when in truth, I think for a lot of us, our voices have been there when no one else has, and we don't want them to go away. All the strong female writers, I'm going to channel them while I write my book. Each of us has the ability to define our own experiences, and that's vastly different than what you get in the mental health system. No one that hears voices is alone. You know, I have a choice over what I listen to and what I respond to and what I obey, but I definitely don't have a choice about what I hear.
After we leave, how long do you anticipate my voice staying in your head?
You know what's interesting? I might always hear your voice. Like, it could go away, so maybe, it'll probably be like, I don't know, if I was to guess, maybe a week or two.
I think that if we talk to people individually outside of the peer pressure, people would say, yeah, hearing voices is an amazing phenomenon. If you actually describe it, they'd be like, wow, that sounds really weird, really interesting.
I was leaving a seminar when it started, humming to myself, fumbling with my bag, just as I'd done 100 times before, when suddenly I heard a voice calmly observe, "She is leaving the room." I looked around and there was no one there, but the clarity and decisiveness of the comment was unmistakable. Shaken, I left my books on the stairs and hurried home, and there it was again. She is opening the door. This was the beginning. The voice had arrived. And the voice persisted. Days and then weeks of it, on, narrating everything I did in the third person. She is going to the library. She is going to a lecture. It was neutral. impassive, and even, after a while, strangely companionate and reassuring, although I did notice that its calm exterior sometimes slipped in that it occasionally mirrored my own unexpressed emotion. So, for example, if I was angry and had to hide it, which I often did, being very adept at concealing how I really felt, then the voice would sound frustrated. Otherwise, it was neither sinister nor disturbing, although even at that point, it was clear that it had something to communicate to me about my emotions, particularly emotions which were remote and inaccessible. Now, it was then that I made a fatal mistake in that I told a friend about the voice, and she was horrified. A subtle conditioning process had begun. The implication that normal people don't hear voices, and the fact that I did, meant that something was very seriously wrong. Such fear and mistrust was infectious. Suddenly, the voice didn't seem quite so benign anymore. And when she insisted that I seek medical attention, I duly complied, and which proved to be mistake number 2. I spent some time telling the college GP about what I perceived to be the real problem: anxiety, low self-worth, fears about the future, and was met with bored indifference until I mentioned the voice, upon which he dropped his pen, swung round, and began to question me with a show of real interest. And to be fair, I was desperate for interest and help, and I began to tell him about my strange commentator. And I always wish at this point the voice had said, "She is digging her own grave." I was referred to a psychiatrist who likewise took a grim view of the voice's presence, subsequently interpreting everything I said through a lens of latent insanity. For example, I was part of a student TV station that broadcast news bulletins around the campus, and during an appointment, which was running very late, said, "I'm sorry, doctor, I've got to go, I'm reading the news at 6. Now, it's down in my medical records that Eleanor has delusions that she's a television news broadcaster. It was at this point that events began to rapidly overtake me. A hospital admission followed, the first of many. A diagnosis of schizophrenia came next. And then, worst of all, a toxic, tormenting sense of hopelessness, humiliation, and despair about myself and my prospects. But having been encouraged to see the voice, not as an experience, but as a symptom, my fear and resistance towards it intensified. Now, essentially, this represented taking an aggressive stance towards my own mind, a kind of psychic civil war. And in turn, this caused the number of voices to increase and grow progressively hostile and menacing. Helplessly and hopelessly, I began to retreat into this nightmarish inner world in which the voices were destined to become both my persecutors and my only perceived companions. They told me, for example, that if I proved myself worthy of their help, then they could change my life back to how it had been. And a series of increasingly bizarre tasks was set, a kind of labor of Hercules. It started off quite small, for example, pull out 3 strands of hair, but gradually it grew more extreme, culminating in commands to harm myself and a particularly dramatic instruction. You see that tutor over there? You see that glass of water? We have to go over and pour it over him in front of the other students, which I actually did, and which, needless to say, did not endear me to the faculty. In effect, a vicious cycle of fear, avoidance, mistrust, and misunderstanding had been established. This was a battle in which I felt powerless and incapable of establishing any kind of peace or reconciliation. 2 years later, and the deterioration was dramatic. By now, I had the whole frenzied repertoire: terrifying voices, grotesque visions, bizarre, intractable delusions. My mental health status had been a catalyst for discrimination, verbal abuse, and physical and sexual assault. And I'd been told by my psychiatrist, "Eleanor, you'd be better off with cancer, because cancer is easier to cure than schizophrenia." I'd been diagnosed, drugged, and discarded, and was by now so tormented by the voices that I attempted to drill a hole in my head in order to get them out. Now, looking back on the wreckage and despair of those years, it seems to me now as if someone died in that place, and yet someone else was saved. A broken and haunted person began that journey, but the person who emerged was a survivor and would ultimately grow into the person I was destined to be. Many people have harmed me in my life, and I remember them all, but the memories grow pale and faint in comparison with the people who've helped me. The fellow survivors, the fellow voice hearers, the comrades and collaborators. The mother who never gave up on me, who knew that one day I would come back to her and was willing to wait for me for as long as it took. The doctor who only worked with me for a brief time, but who reinforced his belief that recovery was not only possible, but inevitable. And during a devastating period of relapse, told my terrified family, "Don't give up hope. I believe that Eleanor can get through this. Sometimes, it snows as late as May, but summer always comes eventually." I remember, for example, sitting up one night on guard outside my parents' room to protect them from what I thought was a genuine threat from the voices, because I'd had such a bad problem with self-injury that most of the cutlery in the house had been hidden. So I ended up arming myself with a plastic fork, like picnic-ware, and sort of sat outside the room clutching it, waiting to spring into action should anything happen. It was like, don't mess with me. Got a plastic fork, don't you know? No, strategic. But a later response, and much more useful, would be to try and deconstruct the message behind the words. So when the voices warned me not to leave the house, then I would thank them for drawing my attention to how unsafe I felt, because if I was aware of it, then I could do something positive about it. But go on to reassure both them and myself that we were safe and didn't need to feel frightened anymore. I would set boundaries for the voices and try to interact with them in a way that was assertive yet respectful, establishing a slow process of communication and collaboration in which we could learn to work together and support one another. Throughout all of this, what I would ultimately realize was that each voice was closely related to aspects of myself, and that each of them carried overwhelming emotions that I'd never had an opportunity to process or resolve. Memories of sexual trauma and abuse, of anger, shame, guilt, low self-worth. The voices took the place of this pain and gave words to it.
Our frequencies shifting. We're electronic beings, and we're starting to become more aware of what's always been there. So it's my passion to educate you guys about each one of your gifts, how they work, what the symptoms are when you're starting to experience in them. Why are you experiencing these gifts? Because Spirit's letting you know that they want to work with you. Today we're going to be talking about clairaudience, psychic hearing, your gift, the voices in your head, right? One of my videos on YouTube, if you haven't checked it out, it's going to have a lot of the similar things here, but it's my most viewed video. I think I don't even know, over 50,000 views, because so many people are searching am I freaking crazy? I'm hearing voices in my head. A lot of people that reach out to me with clairaudience, psychic hearing problems are parents of teenage girls. Believe it or not, it's mostly parents of teenage girls. Please help me. My daughter's hearing voices. I know she's not crazy. I don't want to take her to the medical community. This is also why I'm so passionate about teaching you guys this, because hello, if you hear somebody talking to you, right? Melissa from Canada, yes. We did a whole video on Is Your Third Eye Open in Your Spiritual, and I think it's on the podcast too, or if it's not on there, it'll be up soon. Hey, Nancy. So yeah, one of the signs of clairaudience is you hear voices. You hear voices talking to you, and you're like, shit, that's not me. And so the first thing is oh my God, I'm freaking crazy. I'm losing my mind. But a lot of you guys are scared to go to the medical community because you know what's probably going to happen. They're gonna medicate you. They're gonna cover up your symptoms, or they're gonna lock you up, right? Depending how extreme the voices are. So the reason why I like to educate you guys is to let you know you're not crazy. It's actually a gift. All of our gifts, when they start to turn on, are kind of scary. Because why? Because it's not considered normal. You don't go out at the water cooler at work and be like, I heard my spirit guide talking to me last night. You just don't talk about it. So it's not considered the societal norm. So a lot of people get really freaked out, especially with clairaudience, because it is kind of freaky. For me, mine comes from the left, usually. Mine will come from the left. Some people's comes from the right. Some people realize that the thoughts in their head actually come from a different area. So you can also receive thoughts through your head as clairaudience. It's almost as if it's a thought of your own, but it pops in. It just pops in. A thought just pops in from nowhere. All right, that's usually clairaudience. It's just a voiceless thought. It's a voiceless thought that just pops in. You just think that it doesn't come from anywhere. So clairaudient spirits can kind of use electronics a little bit to use it to kind of shift and change, and you'll be able to pick up on these voices, right? So the ceiling fan in the bathroom, I know one of our girls, Amy Ringo, right? Amy says her bathroom. Oh, and then one of our other girls, she's a clairaudient medium, a clairaudient paranormal medium. Somebody just said yes. Your comment flew away, so I didn't get to see it. But She hears like anything, the vacuum, any sort of white noise. She hears spirit talking to her. So that's another way to receive information from Clairaudience. And for me, it'll start ringing in the very center of my head, and it's not even in my ears. It's like coming from the very center of my head, and it's like, that is like when I get to the sweet spot and I know that I am connected with the divine, and that ringing is adjusting my DNA, that ringing is giving me everything that I need and more for in that moment, right? A lot of times, yes, Karen, the ringing is a download. It's you being connected to source. It's you either receiving information from source, or like when I said, when I'm doing the meditation, it is you actually being connected. You're actually like plugged in, and you are just getting everything you need at that moment. So it's a frequency thing, but the high-pitched ear ringing is if it just, and sometimes it almost feels like you jump in a pool. You know, when you like jump in a pool, do you ever get that weird feeling where you like feel like you went down into the deep water? That's a lot of times when your clairaudience is activating, right? Or something's happening, and that's a sign for you to stop and be conscious and be aware and be in this moment and be there for this information that you're receiving. So these are some of the symptoms, and the knocking. So the clicking, the knocking, the clicking and the knocking. The knocking is usually a past level one, usually knocking, or even a lower level energy, like knocking to get your attention. If they're trying to be like, hey, I want to talk to you. Like, how many of you guys have had your knocking, right? How many of you guys had like heard knocking? That's usually your loved ones like trying to get attention. How many of you guys have heard knocking and you're somebody sitting next to you didn't hear it? That's when I'm like, did you hear that? And the people next to you are like, no. You're like, well, I guess that was meant for me, right? Yeah. So that's your loved one.